Let's begin with these Teapot tapes. Could taxpayers help foot the bill? The Prime Minister's bill to settle a defamation suit with the journalist over them. John Key will make a small cash payment to freelance cameraman Bradley Ambrose to settle the case. Mr Ambrose was at the centre of a scandal involving an audio recording he says he made accidentally in that build-up to the 2011 election campaign. You'll remember a meeting between John Banks and the Prime Minister in a cafe in Newmarket. Bradley Ambrose had been seeking $1.25 million in damages from John Key for alleged defamatory comments following the recording of the Prime Minister's conversation with then ACT leader John Banks. Our political editor Jane Patterson has been covering this afternoon and now joins us live from Parliament. Jane, welcome. Why has this happened? What has taken place? What has Bradley Ambrose said to John Key, and what has John Key said to Bradley Ambrose?
Well, there was a defamation case that was heading to court. There was a settlement conference yesterday with Mr Key and Mr Ambrose, and Mr Key says that a pragmatic decision was taken that it would cost more to take this case to court than it would to make a settlement. Now, we don't know how much the settlement is. He says it's a small payment, and that's in relation to the potential court costs if this had gone ahead. Now, also in terms of where this money is going to come from, Mr Key has just told us at his post-cabinet news briefing that he's already had the legal costs approved by the Speaker of the House, and this is out of a Parliamentary Leaders Fund that leaders can use for a variety of purposes, mainly though if they're for parliamentary purposes. Now, he has to make another application for a settlement, the actual settlement payment that hasn't yet been received by the Speaker. Now, we have the rules for what those are for, and it's basically if the MP has had legal charges brought against them or legal action acting in their capacity as an MP. So Mr Key argues that he was acting as the leader of the National Party, not as the Prime Minister, for example, in which case Crown Law would have actually covered the cost, and not as a private person. But we have these rules, and there's also a Speaker's direction that the Speaker, David Carter, will have to consider whether they'll be approved or whether they're not within the rules. That's not a public document. If this doesn't fall within the rules, the money will come out of the National Party coffers.
OK, so the Speaker makes this determination, Jane?
That's right. So one of the other rules for these for this fund is that it has to go to the Speaker, and he has a variety of thresholds that he has to look at. So the legal costs have already been paid. We don't know that amount either.
Jane, can we go back to 2011? It's 5 years ago, but I think you were on the campaign trail at the time, and I remember it vividly because there were threats of search warrants, the police were involved, there was some fairly emotive language from the Prime Minister about how cynical he regarded this all as being. I think there was a phrase, what was news of the world or something. Can you remind us of what occurred at the time?
That's right, it really was a political stunt that went very wrong. Mr Key was meeting John Banks, the then leader of the ACT Party, and that was all part of the cup of tea tradition that Mr Key had adopted, and sending a signal to voters that National would be keen to have ACT as a support partner. Now, the media this was in a cafe, the media were all shunted outside. Mr Key and Mr Banks had a private conversation. Mr Ambrose left a recorder from his camera on the table and recorded that conversation. Now, he always claimed it was inadvertent. Mr Key, though, came out saying it was clearly done deliberately, news of the world tabloid type behaviour, and it really dominated the election campaign from then on, because 4 search warrants were executed on a number of news organisations, including Radio New Zealand, to get footage of that actual event. So it was a big deal. Mr Key now has obviously backed down from those comments, but no apology to Bradley Ambrose.